Sir, if you don't leave that seat right now, airport security will remove you from this aircraft.
Sir, if you don't leave that seat right now, airport security will remove you from this aircraft. The words cut through the first-class cabin so sharply that every conversation stopped. A businessman across the aisle slowly folded his newspaper. A woman holding a glass of champagne froze before it reached her lips. Even the captain, standing near the cockpit waiting for the boarding door to close, turned toward seat 2A. Every pair of eyes settled on the same passenger. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't refusing to cooperate. He wasn't making threats. He simply sat there, calm and composed, with one hand resting on a worn canvas duffel bag beneath the seat in front of him. The senior flight attendant, Lauren Brooks, folded her arms and repeated herself with complete confidence. "Sir, this is your final warning." The man slowly looked up. His expression never changed. Instead of arguing, he asked one quiet question. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" Lauren didn't hesitate. "I've never been more certain." The passenger simply nodded. He reached into his pocket, unlocked his phone, typed a short message, and slipped it back into his jacket. No explanation. No complaint. No attempt to defend himself. He simply waited. 5 minutes later, everything inside that aircraft changed. The boarding door burst open. 2 senior airline executives hurried onto the plane with expressions that immediately caught the captain's attention. The businessman who had insisted the passenger didn't belong suddenly stopped smiling. Lauren Brooks felt the confidence drain from her face. And before Flight 417 ever left the gate, everyone on board wished they had never judged the quiet man sitting in seat 2A. But to understand why, you first have to know who Daniel Carter really was. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy powerful true-to-life stories about justice, integrity, and unexpected twists, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first glance, Daniel Carter looked like the least important person in the entire first-class cabin. His navy button-down shirt was neatly pressed but clearly not new. His jeans were clean, faded, and practical. His brown leather shoes had the kind of wear that comes from years of walking through airports instead of replacing them every season. The canvas duffel bag beneath his seat looked older than some of the passengers around him. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Nothing about him looked exclusive. If you had walked through that cabin without knowing his story, you probably would have assumed he was an ordinary traveler who had somehow wandered into the wrong section of the aircraft. That assumption was exactly what everyone else had made. No one asked who he was. No one wondered why he had boarded with a valid first-class ticket. Instead, they judged what they could see. Lauren Brooks had spent 15 years working as a flight attendant. She had handled medical emergencies, severe turbulence, difficult passengers, and delayed flights. Experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and on that morning her instincts told her something wasn't right. The wealthy passengers surrounding Daniel wore tailored suits, luxury watches, and expensive luggage. Daniel looked nothing like them. To Lauren, he didn't fit the picture of someone who regularly flew in first class. Across the aisle sat Victor Reynolds, a successful real estate developer known for reminding people of his importance. He flew first class so often that several members of the crew recognized him before he even reached his seat. As boarding continued, Victor couldn't stop looking at Daniel. Finally, he leaned toward Lauren and spoke quietly. "I think there's been a mistake." Lauren looked at him. "I don't believe that gentleman belongs up here." She nodded politely. "I'll take care of it." That single conversation would set everything else into motion. When Lauren approached Daniel for the first time, she expected a simple misunderstanding. She assumed he had accidentally boarded the wrong cabin or mixed up his seat assignment. Instead, Daniel calmly handed her his boarding pass. Seat 2A. First class. Everything was valid. Lauren looked at the ticket once. Then again. The information was correct. Yet something inside her refused to believe it. Rather than trusting the evidence in her hands, she trusted the picture she had already created in her mind. She returned the boarding pass. "Sir, would you mind stepping off the aircraft while we verify a few things?" Daniel looked at her politely. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" "No." "Has someone else been assigned this seat?" "No." "Then I believe I'm sitting exactly where your airline asked me to." His voice remained calm. That calmness frustrated Lauren more than an argument would have. Passengers had started listening. Whispers spread through the cabin. Victor Reynolds folded his arms, convinced the issue would be resolved within minutes. But Daniel never moved. Not because he wanted a confrontation. Because he knew he had done nothing wrong. Daniel Carter had spent most of his life solving problems without raising his voice, long before anyone associated his name with multi-million-dollar aviation contracts. He had worn a military uniform instead of a business suit. As an Air Force aircraft mechanic, he learned that panic fixed nothing. Precision did. Every bolt he tightened and every engine he inspected carried the responsibility of bringing someone home safely. Those years taught him discipline, patience, and one lesson he never forgot. When you know you're standing on the truth, you don't have to shout to defend it. After leaving the Air Force, Daniel didn't inherit a company or receive special opportunities. He worked long days repairing aircraft for small operators that couldn't afford expensive maintenance providers. He earned every promotion through reliability instead of connections. Then life changed forever. He married the woman he loved, and together they welcomed a daughter named Emily. Daniel often said becoming Emily's father was the greatest achievement of his life. Then, without warning, tragedy struck. Emily was still a little girl when Daniel's wife passed away following a sudden medical emergency. One ordinary afternoon became the dividing line between the life Daniel had planned and the life he was forced to build alone. Standing beside his wife's hospital bed, he made one promise that would shape every decision he made from that day forward. He looked at his sleeping daughter and quietly said, "No matter what happens, I'll always be there for you." Daniel never broke that promise. And on the morning, he boarded Flight 417. That promise was the real reason he couldn't afford to miss his flight. Daniel rarely talked about the hardest season of his life. Those closest to him knew that after his wife's passing, something about him changed forever. He became quieter, more patient, more deliberate with every decision he made. Friends encouraged him to sell the family home and start over somewhere new, but Daniel refused. Emily had already lost her mother. He wasn't about to take away the only home she still recognized. Every morning he woke before sunrise, made breakfast, braided Emily's hair the best he could after watching countless tutorial videos, packed her school lunch and drove her to class before beginning another 12-hour shift. When work ended, his second job began. Homework, dinner, laundry, bedtime stories, and comforting a little girl who still whispered, "I miss Mom." On nights she thought her father was asleep. Daniel never pretended to have all the answers. He simply made sure Emily never faced those moments alone. Without realizing it, she became the reason he kept moving forward when grief tried to convince him to stop. Money was tight during those early years. There were weeks when Daniel skipped buying new clothes for himself so Emily could join school field trips or replace outgrown shoes. His pickup truck had more miles on it than most people thought possible, but it kept running because he repaired it himself every weekend. Luxury wasn't part of their lives, and Daniel never apologized for that. What mattered to him wasn't how much he owned. It was whether Emily felt safe when she walked through the front door every afternoon. Years later, Emily would tell friends she never knew they struggled financially because her father somehow made every birthday feel special, every Christmas feel magical, and every ordinary weekend feel like an adventure. Looking back, Daniel would always say those years taught him a lesson no business school ever could. Success isn't measured by what you accumulate. It's measured by the people who know they can count on you when life becomes difficult. As Emily grew older, Daniel noticed something that bothered him every time he walked into another aircraft maintenance hangar. Companies were becoming faster, but not necessarily better. Deadlines were tightening. Budgets were shrinking. More executives were asking mechanics how quickly repairs could be completed instead of asking whether they had been completed correctly. Daniel had seen enough during his Air Force years to understand how dangerous that mindset could become. Airplanes don't care about quarterly profits. They don't reward shortcuts. Every passenger boarding a flight places enormous trust in people they'll never meet, believing someone inspected every critical part before takeoff. Daniel couldn't ignore what he was seeing. Eventually, he made the decision that would change his life forever. With savings that barely covered a year's expenses, Daniel rented a small maintenance hangar on the edge of a regional airport. There were no ribbon-cutting ceremonies, no investors, and no media attention. On the first day, his entire team consisted of 3 former military mechanics who believed in the same simple principle. If your own family wouldn't fly on that airplane, you don't sign the inspection paperwork. That philosophy became the foundation of everything Daniel built. While competing companies promised faster turnaround times, Daniel promised something different. Every aircraft leaving his hangar would be maintained as though Emily herself were sitting in the first row. Some potential customers laughed at that promise, claiming it was unrealistic in a competitive industry. Daniel didn't argue. He simply kept doing the work. Slowly, word began spreading throughout the aviation community. Airlines discovered that aircraft maintained by Daniel's company experienced fewer unexpected maintenance issues. Pilots specifically requested technicians trained under his standards. One satisfied customer recommended another, then another. Within a decade, the small hangar had grown into one of the most respected aircraft maintenance companies in the country. Daniel now employed hundreds of mechanics across multiple facilities, yet almost nothing about his personal life had changed. He still packed his own lunches when traveling. He still drove a pickup truck. He still wore practical clothes instead of designer suits. Employees often laughed that first-time visitors usually mistook him for the senior mechanic rather than the company's owner. Daniel never corrected them unless the conversation required it. Titles didn't interest him. Results did. The invitation from Richard Whitmore's airline had arrived 3 weeks before Flight 417. After months of negotiations, the airline wanted Daniel's company to become its primary maintenance partner, a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the coming years. Richard insisted on meeting Daniel personally in New York before the final agreement was signed. Most business leaders would have seen the meeting as the most important appointment on their calendar. Daniel didn't. He accepted only after discovering that one of the nation's leading pediatric specialists practiced less than 20 minutes from the airline's headquarters. Emily had been waiting months for an opening with that doctor. Daniel arranged both appointments on the same day because no business meeting, regardless of its value, would ever come before his daughter. That was why missing Flight 417 wasn't simply an inconvenience. It meant risking an appointment Emily had waited nearly a year to receive. None of that was visible to Lauren Brooks or Victor Reynolds. All they saw was a man wearing faded jeans, carrying an old canvas duffel bag, sitting quietly in seat 2A. And within minutes, those assumptions would push the situation beyond a simple misunderstanding. Lauren Brooks returned to Daniel's seat one final time. This time, her expression was different. There was no uncertainty left. Only authority. She took a slow breath before speaking. "Mr. Carter, if you refuse to leave your seat, I'll have no choice but to call airport security." For the first time since boarding began, the entire first-class cabin fell completely silent. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He slowly looked out the window at the baggage crews moving across the tarmac, then back at Lauren Brooks. There wasn't the slightest trace of anger on his face. Years of military service had taught him that emotions often cloud judgment, and Daniel had learned long ago that the calmest person in the room usually understood the situation best. "Am I being removed because my boarding pass isn't valid?" he asked. Lauren hesitated. "No. Have I violated any airline policy?" Again she paused. "No. Then why am I being asked to leave my seat?" For a brief moment, Lauren couldn't find an answer that sounded reasonable. She had convinced herself something was wrong. Yet every fact continued proving Daniel right. His ticket was genuine. His identification matched the reservation. The seat assignment belonged to him. But after 15 years of trusting her instincts, admitting she had made the wrong call in front of an entire first-class cabin felt almost impossible. Before she could respond, Victor Reynolds leaned forward. "We're wasting everyone's time," he said loudly enough for several rows to hear. "If he refuses to cooperate, remove him. Some of us have important meetings to get to." A few passengers nodded quietly. Others simply avoided eye contact. No one wanted to become involved. Human nature has a strange way of following the loudest opinion in the room, especially when people believe someone else has already decided who's right and who's wrong. Daniel looked briefly toward Victor. There was no resentment in his eyes, only disappointment. He had met people like Victor throughout his career, men who measured success by expensive watches, private clubs, and the size of their offices. Daniel had never hated people like that. He simply wished they understood how little those things mattered when life truly tested a person. Lauren straightened her uniform. "Mr. Carter, I'm asking you one last time." Daniel nodded politely. "And I'm respectfully declining because I've done nothing wrong." The answer was calm, respectful, unshaken. Lauren reached for the interphone beside the galley. "This is Lauren in first class. I need a gate supervisor on board immediately." Within less than a minute, the boarding door opened. A middle-aged gate supervisor stepped inside with a tablet in his hand. He smiled professionally. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm Michael. I've been told there's a seating issue." Daniel handed him his boarding pass without saying another word. Michael scanned it. "Seat 2A. First class." Everything matched perfectly. He checked the passenger manifest. Again, everything matched. He frowned slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, looking toward Lauren. "I'm not seeing a problem." Lauren lowered her voice. "I know the paperwork is correct." "Then what's the issue?" She glanced toward Daniel before answering. "I just don't believe he belongs in first class." The words hung in the air. Michael stared at her. "You don't believe he belongs?" Lauren immediately realized how those words sounded. "That's not exactly what I meant." But it was, and everyone nearby knew it. Daniel quietly took his boarding pass back and slipped it into his pocket. He never interrupted. He never smiled. He never tried to embarrass anyone. Victor, however, wasn't finished. "This airline advertises premium service," he said. "If someone can just walk in dressed like that and sit up here, what exactly are people paying for?" Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. One elderly woman quietly looked toward Daniel, then back toward Victor. She seemed to be wondering whether anyone was going to speak up. No one did. Michael rubbed his forehead. Departure time was slipping away. Passengers were growing impatient. Lauren was standing by her decision. Victor was demanding action. Daniel refused to leave because, as far as every official record showed, he had every legal right to remain exactly where he was. Michael made the decision he would later regret. He reached for his radio. "I need airport security at gate 14. The cabin instantly fell silent. Those 3 words changed everything. Airport security. Several passengers exchanged nervous glances. Someone whispered, "Is it really that serious?" Victor leaned back into his seat, satisfied that the matter would finally be resolved. Lauren exhaled slowly, believing she had done her job. Daniel simply folded his hands together. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't nervous. He had experienced far more difficult moments than this. Losing his wife, holding Emily's hand at the hospital, wondering how he would pay the next month's bills while trying to build a company from almost nothing. Compared to those moments, this was simply another misunderstanding. Outside the aircraft windows, 2 airport security officers appeared at the entrance to the jet bridge. Passengers noticed them immediately. The officers walked with purpose, expecting to deal with another disruptive traveler. Neither had any idea they were about to walk into one of the biggest mistakes the airline had made in years. As they approached the aircraft door, Daniel's phone vibrated quietly inside his jacket. He glanced at the screen. A single message. "Just arrived at gate 14. Be there in 30 seconds. Richard Whitmore." Daniel locked the screen without responding. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Across the cabin, Victor Reynolds smiled confidently. Lauren Brooks looked toward the boarding door, waiting for security to appear. Neither of them noticed another man running through the terminal. He wasn't wearing a security uniform. He wasn't carrying luggage. Airport employees stepped aside the moment they recognized him. The captain saw him through the cockpit window, and his expression changed instantly. The boarding door swung open before the airport security officers could take another step. A man in a dark suit hurried onto the aircraft, breathing heavily from the run through the terminal. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't a member of the cabin crew. Yet the moment the captain saw him, he immediately walked forward. "Mr. Whitmore," the captain said, surprised, "we weren't expecting you." Richard Whitmore barely acknowledged the greeting. His eyes swept across the first-class cabin until they stopped on Daniel Carter. A look of relief crossed his face. "There you are," Richard said as he walked quickly down the aisle. "I've been trying to catch you before we departed." The cabin fell silent. Lauren Brooks stepped aside without thinking. Victor Reynolds frowned, unsure what he was watching. Richard stopped beside seat 2A and extended his hand. "Mr. Carter, I'm Richard Whitmore. Thank you for making this trip." Daniel stood and shook his hand. "It's good to see you again, Richard." The words landed like a thunderclap. Victor's confident expression disappeared. Lauren's face turned pale. She looked from Daniel to Richard, then back again. Richard noticed the 2 airport security officers standing near the boarding door. He looked confused. "Why is security here?" No one answered. Richard repeated the question. "Why is airport security standing on my aircraft?" Lauren finally spoke. I requested them." "For Mr. Carter?" "Yes." Richard stared at her for several seconds. Then he looked toward the gate supervisor. "Has Mr. Carter violated any airline policy?" "No." "Is his ticket valid?" "Yes." "Is seat 2A assigned to him?" "Yes." Richard slowly nodded. "Then someone needs to explain why the man we've spent the last 6 months trying to meet was nearly removed from this airplane." The entire cabin froze. Victor Reynolds looked at Daniel with disbelief. 6 months. Richard continued. "Mr. Carter owns Carter Aviation Services. A few passengers exchanged confused looks. Richard noticed. I don't expect most people to recognize the company. He looked around the cabin. But every airplane our airline operates is inspected and maintained under standards developed by Mr. Carter's team. Another silence settled over the aircraft. Our passengers trust us with their lives every single day, Richard continued. We trust Daniel Carter to help keep those passengers safe. Victor swallowed hard. Only minutes earlier, he had implied Daniel didn't belong in first class. Now he was learning that the quiet man sitting across the aisle played a role in protecting thousands of passengers every day. Richard looked back at Daniel. I can't apologize enough for what happened. Daniel gave a small smile. Richard, I'd rather we focus on getting everyone to New York. Richard shook his head. No. He turned toward Lauren Brooks. This isn't just about one passenger. Lauren lowered her eyes. I understand. I hope you do, Richard replied, because today we didn't judge a customer by his behavior. He paused. We judged him by his appearance. Lauren took a slow breath before stepping toward Daniel. Mr. Carter. Her voice was noticeably quieter than before. I owe you an apology. Daniel listened. I looked at your clothes instead of your boarding pass. She swallowed. I believed my assumptions instead of the facts. I'm sorry. Daniel nodded. Thank you. That was all he said. No lecture. No anger. No attempt to embarrass her in front of the passengers. That simple response somehow made Lauren feel even worse. Victor Reynolds slowly stood from his seat. He looked directly at Daniel. I owe you an apology too. Daniel waited. I decided who you were before I even knew your name. Daniel smiled politely. It happens more often than you'd think. Victor looked down. I'll remember this for a long time. Daniel answered with one sentence that every passenger on Flight 417 would remember. Respect should never depend on what someone is wearing. No one spoke after that, because no one could disagree. The captain looked toward Richard Whitmore. Are we cleared to depart? Richard nodded. Yes. Then he looked once more at Daniel Carter. There was still one thing no one on that aircraft knew. Daniel hadn't boarded Flight 417 because of a business contract. The real reason he couldn't miss this flight had nothing to do with money. Waiting for him in New York was someone who mattered more to him than every contract he'd ever signed. Flight 417 lifted smoothly into the afternoon sky, climbing above the clouds as the tension that had gripped the cabin slowly gave way to an uneasy silence. The confrontation was over, but no one seemed interested in returning to what they had been doing before. Newspapers remained folded. Laptops stayed closed. Conversations never resumed. Every passenger was left alone with the same uncomfortable thought: how quickly they had accepted a story about Daniel Carter without knowing a single fact about him. Daniel leaned back in his seat and looked out the window. He had no interest in replaying what had happened. He wasn't wondering whether Lauren Brooks would face disciplinary action, nor was he thinking about Victor Reynolds' apology. Those decisions belonged to the airline. Daniel's thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He reached into the worn canvas duffel bag that had caused so much unnecessary suspicion and carefully removed a small blue folder. It wasn't filled with business contracts. Inside were medical records, appointment confirmations, test results, and one photograph. The picture showed Daniel standing beside a smiling teenage girl with shoulder-length brown hair. Emily had one arm wrapped around her father's shoulder, laughing as though nothing in the world could hurt her. Daniel smiled quietly. That photograph had traveled with him everywhere for years. Across the aisle, Victor noticed the medical paperwork but immediately looked away. He suddenly understood why Daniel had remained so determined to stay on that flight. This journey had never been about luxury. It had been about family. A few minutes later, Richard Whitmore returned to Daniel's seat. "I thought you might want to know," he said quietly. "I've already called the hospital." Daniel looked up. "They know you'll be arriving directly from the airport. Your appointment with Dr. Harris is confirmed." For the first time that day, Daniel looked genuinely relieved. "Thank you." Richard smiled. "I also asked if they could move you to the front of the afternoon schedule." Daniel nodded gratefully. "I appreciate that more than you know." Richard glanced toward the blue folder. "How's Emily holding up?" Daniel took a slow breath. "Better than I expected." He paused before continuing. "After losing her mother, she's had more hospital visits than any child should." Richard remained silent. "She never complains," Daniel continued. "She tells me she's fine even when I know she's scared." He looked back at the photograph. "I promised her we'd keep looking until we found the best specialist." Richard understood. That promise was why Daniel had accepted the airline's invitation in the first place. The business meeting could have happened next week. Or next month. Emily's appointment couldn't. Richard placed a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder. "We're going to make sure you get there." Daniel smiled. "I know." The rest of the flight passed quietly. When Flight 417 landed in New York, Richard personally escorted Daniel through the terminal to a waiting vehicle the airline had arranged. Lauren Brooks stood beside the aircraft door as passengers departed. When Daniel reached her, she spoke softly. "Mr. Carter." Daniel stopped. "I've been thinking about everything that happened today." She took a deep breath. "I've spent years telling new crew members that every passenger deserves respect." A sad smile crossed her face. "And today, I forgot my own lesson." Daniel nodded. "We all have moments we're not proud of." Lauren looked at him. "I hope someday you'll forgive me." Daniel answered without hesitation. "I already have." Those 4 words nearly brought tears to her eyes. He picked up the old canvas duffel bag. "Take care of yourself, Lauren." "You too, and I hope Emily's appointment goes well." Daniel smiled warmly. "Thank you." He walked into the terminal without looking back. Nearly 40 minutes later, his car stopped outside one of New York's leading children's hospitals. Before the driver could even open the door, Daniel saw Emily standing near the entrance. The moment she spotted him, she ran. "Dad!" Daniel dropped the duffel bag onto the sidewalk and opened his arms. Emily threw her arms around his neck. For several seconds, neither of them said a word. Nothing else mattered. Not the airline. Not the contract. Not the misunderstanding. Only that hug. Only the promise he had made years earlier. "I told you I'd be here," Daniel whispered. Emily smiled. "I knew you would." Watching from the hospital entrance, Richard Whitmore quietly smiled to himself. In that moment, he realized something no business meeting could ever teach. Daniel Carter wasn't respected because he owned a successful company. He wasn't admired because airlines trusted his expertise. He was admired because success had never changed the kind of man he chose to be. On the flight that morning, strangers saw an ordinary man carrying an old canvas bag. What they failed to see was a devoted father carrying years of sacrifice, responsibility, and love. Appearances can tell you what someone is wearing. They can never tell you what someone has survived. If there's one lesson to take from Daniel Carter's story, it's this. Treat every person with respect before they've earned it in your eyes. Because the next quiet passenger you overlook may be carrying a story far greater than you'll ever imagine. And now we'd love to hear from you. If you had been sitting on flight 417 that day, would you have spoken up for Daniel Carter, or would you have assumed he didn't belong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another powerful story about character, justice, and the extraordinary people hiding in plain sight. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.